Then look at verse 16. They said, Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also the princes and all the people. And so the queen's conduct will become known to who? To all the women. And so when the women find out what Vashti did, there's going to be trouble in every household throughout the land. And so King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought to his presence, but she did not come. And so she was banished as being queen. She was rejected to no longer have a royal position. Now, in chapter 2, which is the second part of this picture number 1, there was the selection of Esther to be the queen. And we go to chapter 2 now, and after the banishment of Vashti from the kingdom and as the queen of Ahasuerus, we learn in chapter 2 and verse number 2, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So throughout the land, they're looking for young, beautiful young women who have never known a man. And said they brought every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, in the custom of Haggai, the king's eunuch. And then verse 4, let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in the place of Vashti. Now, and if you'll notice down in verse 5, there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai. Some call it Mordecai, but I've always called it Mordecai. I'll do that till I die. That's kind of a rhyming in. I'm a poet and I don't know it. Now verse 6. Mordecai had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives. And so they are in Persia now. That was during the reign of Jeconiah, the king of Judah. And then in verse 7, he was bringing Hadassah, that is, when Esther, his uncle's daughter, Esther had another name, Hadassah, however you want to pronounce it. So her parents had died. Mordecai then began to raise Esther. Actually, Esther was his cousin. Some people used to call him an uncle, but I think it was a cousin. And she was very beautiful. If you'll notice verse 7, it says, the young lady was beautiful of form and face. And so he took care of her as his own daughter. Then down in verse 8, we learn that of all of the young virgins in the land, Esther was taken into the king's palace and was by Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now, verse 9 says, the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he provided her with what? I'm reading out of the New American Standard Version that says cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Now, in verse number 10, we learn that Esther did not let the king know that she was a Jew, and Mordecai had told her just to keep that quiet. Now, in verse number 11, we find out that Mordecai was very concerned about her welfare. It says that he walked back and forth in front of the court to learn how Esther was and how she fared. And then 12 months go by. You see, she had to prepare herself with all this beauty aids that they had available then, all the cosmetics, the perfume of myrrh and etc., to prepare her beauty to appear before the king. It took 12 months to do that. I suspect some of you did that this morning, 12 minutes, maybe less time, or maybe more time. But nonetheless, they did for 12 months after the regulations for the women. There was a regulation to do that before they could appear before the king. Now, it was 6 months with all of myrrh and 6 months of spices and cosmetics for the women. Now, when it came time for her to appear before the king, he loved her, as we're told, more than all the women. If you'll notice verse 17, we're in chapter 2. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins. Remember, she was beautiful of form and face. Very beautiful young girl. And then Esther kept her, we already mentioned that she kept her nationality a secret. And notice in verse 20 that Mordecai was sitting at the gate, and the king's officials, those who were guarding the gate, became angry. And they became angry not with Mordecai, but they became angry with whom? The Ahasuerus, the king. I don't know why they were upset with the king. That would be equivalent, I suppose, today of us being angry with the president of our nation. And so what they did, because they were upset with Ahasuerus, who was the king of the Persian Empire at this time, they devised a plot. And the plot, verse 22, became known by Mordecai. And he told it to Esther. And Esther informed the king in the name of Mordecai. And then verse number 10, when the plot, so the king had it investigated, if you notice verse 23, and he found that the plot, or what he had learned, was true. Says they found it to be so. So what did they do with these people who got these two at the gate that became angry with the Ahasuerus? What did they do with them? They hung them. They didn't have long to go. They were both hanged on a gallows. And that was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now those two factors are in picture number 1, chapter 2. Vashti is deposed, Esther is made queen. Now let's go to the next picture, and that would be in chapters 3 and 4, picture 2. And here we learn about Haman's promotion, and he devises a plot against Mordecai. And then also in chapter 4, that's chapter 3 and chapter 4, there's a proclamation that's been made about destroying the Jews. So those two things, this is where Haman gets promoted, and let's look at some of the things here. The Haman was promoted and the people were to bow down to him. Now there was Mordecai refused to bow down. If you notice chapter 3, verse 1, Ahasuerus promoted Haman and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were within him. And the servants would bow down and pay homage to Haman, for the king had commanded concerning him. But notice what it says, and there's a last sentence in verse 2. Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. And so the servants of the king came to Mordecai and they said, why are you transgressing the commandment of the king? And they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. That's down in verse 4. He told them that he was a Jew. Now in verse 5, Haman saw Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. And so that filled Haman with rage. Boy, he was so angry, so angry. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy who? He wasn't going to destroy Mordecai, just Mordecai, because he found out that he was a Jew. He said, if I destroy him and him alone, all these people are going to be upset with. I don't want all of them upset with me, so I'll just get rid of all of them. I'm going to destroy the Jews. And so he sought to destroy the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now it was the first month, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of Ahasuerus. I'm in verse 7 now, chapter 3, that the king Ahasuerus pure, that is, the lot was cast before Haman from day to day, month to month, unto the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Haman cast the pur. Now, don't get it, that's a lot. He cast the lot and plotted to destroy the Jews. He convinced the king to kill all the Jews because they spoke against him. And that was done on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, which would be equivalent to our month of March. Now in chapter 4, there's this proclamation. There's a proclamation made, and notice verse 1. Mordecai learned all that had been done. When Mordecai learns of the proclamation to destroy the Jews, he was so unhappy, broken, that he put on sackcloth and ashes, which was a sign of mourning. Now Esther learns of this. Down in verse 4, Esther's maids and her eunuch came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai that they might remove his sackcloth. But he didn't accept the garments that she sent for him to put on. Now, then in verse number 5, Esther has a plan. Esther has a plan. But in this conversation between Mordecai and Esther, which was with a convoy going from Mordecai to Esther, for Esther back to Mordecai, and then Mordecai comes and he delivers this message to Esther. He said, now, this is where our text was, 13 and 14, and Mordecai told her, do not imagine that since you are the king's queen in the king's palace, that if he destroys the Jews, don't think you're going to escape. Verse 14, you might not say anything right now. You might remain silent, but be assured that relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. But here's I think the key to the whole book. Who knows whether you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Question. Who put Esther in the position she was in? God. You see, the providence of God is written almost on every page of the book of Esther. Almost all through the book of Esther, there's God's providence working in the background. So Esther has a plan. Notice in verse number, verse 15, Esther told them to reply to Mordecai and says, I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. She said, if I what? If I do what? If I die, what? I'll die. Said, if I'll go to the king, and if I die or if I perish, I'll just perish. Whatever happens, I'll take it. And so there's this plot that she has. Now, in chapter 5, which is a part of the second snapshot of the book of Esther, she plans a banquet. And Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's room, and the king was sitting on his royal throne. Just try to picture that. In his throne room, opposite the entrance of the palace, the king saw Esther standing in the court, and it says that she obtained favor in his sight. In order for one to have an audience with the king or come before the king, what would the king do to indicate that they had favor to appear before him? He had a scepter in his hand. I'd call it a stick. And if he did like this, then you were accepted. If he extended that scepter toward her, then she could come before her. So the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. So the king asked her this question. What's wrong? What's troubling you, Queen Esther? What's your request? Said, I give you half of the kingdom. That's a lot. I'll give you half the kingdom. So down in verse 4, Esther says, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I prepared for whom? Haman, for him. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And verse 5, they drank wine. Verse 6, that's 6, at the banquet. And the king said, now what's your petition? What's your request? This is my request in verse 8. May the king and Haman come to the banquet. Then Haman went to the banquet. He saw Mordecai when Haman went out that day, glad and pleased in heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and what did Mordecai not do? He didn't bow down to him. Haman was a man full of pride. He wanted Mordecai to bow down to him, and he didn't tremble before him. Notice what it says in the latter part of verse 9. We're still in chapter 5. Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. And Haman controlled himself because he had to go to and went to his house, sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches, the number of his sons, and where the king had magnified him and promoted him and his princes above the princes and servants of the king. He was top dog. To put it another way, he became prime minister. Second to the king. Vice president of Persia, if you please. And then Haman said, even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she has prepared. Tomorrow I am invited by her with the king. Boy, he's gone home bragging a little bit, Jay. He's bragging. He said, Esther the queen has invited me and me alone to come and be with her at a banquet she's prepared for me and with the king. And so he was bragging about himself. And then that in verse number 13, it says, all this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. He said, that may be the case, but I'm still upset because Mordecai will not bow down to me. He will not acknowledge me. Now verse number 14, this is what his wife and friends said to him. Now notice the last verse of chapter 5. What advice did his wife give to him? Anyone? Pardon? Hang him. Have a gallows 50 cubits high. I believe a cubit is I read that, I looked it up because I couldn't remember, I think about 18 inches. So how high? Ben's going to figure out how high that gallows was in a minute. He can do it in his head. I mean, he's got a mathematician head on them shoulders. He did it the other day. Maybe he can do it again. 50 cubits high made. And in the morning asked the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. Have Mordecai hanged, then you go to the banquet with his cousin Esther. And the advice pleased Haman. So he did a terrible thing. What did he do? He had the gallows built. He built the gallows. Keep in mind, he built the gallows for what man? Mordecai. He built the gallows for Mordecai. Now that's the end of picture number 2. Picture number 3. When we look at picture number 3, this covers chapters 6 and 7. And in chapter 6, we're going to be where Mordecai is honored. And listen to this. The king was sleepless. He had insomnia one night. Have you ever had a night like that? I suppose all of us had a night we couldn't sleep. I've had nights like that for no reason, and stay awake all night long. And you really feel good the next morning, don't you, when you have a night like that? No, you don't. But the king couldn't sleep. Now look at verse 1. He could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And then he came across something in those articles about that Mordecai had given some advice. He had given this record about the two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, and they tried to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. You remember we studied that a while ago. And so Mordecai blew the whistle on those two guys, and what happened to them? They were hanged. And so the king read how Mordecai had helped save his life. He helped save his life. And so the king asked, what's been done to honor Mordecai? What was the answer? The latter part of verse 3. Nothing has been done for Mordecai. Well, so the king, desiring to honor Mordecai, asked Haman, of all people. You see, Haman's the only one there. You see, Haman was at the right place at the wrong time. He was at the right place at the wrong time. Sometimes we're at the right place at the right time, but sometimes we can be at the right place at the wrong time. And there's a case of Haman. So he asked Haman what should be done. And he said, now what should we do? Here's the question. What is to be done for the man? This is in verse 6. What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? Now what came into Haman's mind? He was thinking to himself, who would the king want to honor any more than who? Me. If the king wanted to honor anybody, surely he'd want to honor me. So this is what Haman said to the king in verse 7. The man whom the king honors, whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe, which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the horse and the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes. And let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and to lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him. And so he said, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. So you think about it, said this is what you ought to do. Though Haman said, he's going to do this. This is for me. This is for me. Put a robe on him you've worn. Let him ride the horse you've ridden, and you get the royal crest put on his head. And let one of the most noble princes in all of the land lead him on horseback so the people can praise him all through the streets. And so the king said to Haman, look at verse 10, wasn't quite what he expected. Take quickly the robes of the horse you said, do for so to Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. You go out and do what you said ought to be done. So verse 11. So Mordecai took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai, and Haman led him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Verse 12 says, Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. He was crushed. He was humiliated. And so he goes home and to go to whine. And so this plot blew up in his face. And then he says, in verse number 13, he recounted to his wife and his friends everything that had happened. And then the wise men said to him, if Mordecai, by whom you've begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you're not going to overcome him, but surely fall before him. And while they were talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived, and brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. See, he had been invited to this banquet. And so they came into the banquet. And here's where in chapter 7, Esther's plan is complete. You see, then Esther reveals to the king, this plan that had been devised against the Jews. Said, if I found, this is in verse 3, chapter 7, if I found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. And if we have been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance of the king. Verse 5, this is the question Ahasuerus the king asked Esther. Who is he and where is he who would presume to do this? And she points the finger where? At Haman. There he is right there, sitting right there, king, right beside you. That's the man. A foreign enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman became terrified before the king and queen, scared him to death. Now, Haman started begging. The king turned around and went out on the balcony outside the palace, outside where they were. So while he was absent, old Haman goes over there, starts begging the queen, gets on the couch where she's laying, you see, and begging the queen. And about that time, the king comes back in, and there's Haman laying on the couch with Queen Esther. And he says, will you even assault the queen with me in the house? That's in verse number 8. And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And that's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. And so verse number 9, one of the eunuchs said to Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, what? Hang him on it. Hang Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. That's verse 10. Pardon? No, Haman was having a very bad, a terrible, no good, very bad day. Absolutely. 75 feet. A gallows. That's up yonder, isn't it? Now, we're going to look now at picture 4. It's chapters 8, 9, and 10. The last 3 chapters. What we're going to see in chapter 8 is the salvation of Mordecai and the Jewish people. And then in chapter 9, the Jewish victory over their enemies. Now let's look at chapter 8. On the day King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai came before the king before Esther had disclosed what he was to her. In other words, Esther told the king, Mordecai is my relative. He raised me. After my mother and father died, Mordecai raised me, and we're cousins. And then what the king did, notice what he did in verse 2, he took off his signet ring. With that signet ring, he would take it and he would seal things with it. It was, if you ever had something done by a notary, and they will take their stamp, that's kind of like a signet ring. And if there was a decree made, he would stamp it with his signet ring. That made it legal. It was, and I'm sure there are better ways to explain it, but that's the country way to do it, and I'm a country boy. and I'm happy about it. And so he took off his signet ring that he had taken it away from Haman. Remember, he gave it to Haman, he took it back, and he gave it to Mordecai, of all people. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And this is what Esther spoke to the king, said, she wept and implored him to avert the scheme that Haman had devised against the Jews. That's in verse number 3. So this is what happened in verse 4, chapter 8. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before the king. Now this is what she said to the king in verse 5. If it pleases the king, if I found favor before him and it seems proper to the king, and I'm pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. There are a lot of laws that have been, or edicts that have been revoked recently in our nation, right? So they were revoking this plan. And so this plan of Haman's was to destroy the Jews who are in all of the king's provinces. But in verse 4 she said, how can I endure to see the calamity which shall befall my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So this is what the king said to Queen Esther. This is verse 7. I've given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they've hanged on the gallows because he stretched his hand against the Jews. He said, now you write to the Jews as you see fit, the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. Who had the ring? Who had the ring? Mordecai had the ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring may not be revoked. So they sealed it with all this is turning right back around. All back around in favor of Esther and his people. And so he wrote the name of Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. This is verse 10. And sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. Well, they were some of the fastest horses in the land, to carry this news throughout the province that this had been revoked. And the king granted the Jews wherein every city the right to assemble and defend the lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate the entire army of any people or province who might attack them, including children, women, and to plunder their spoils. And so the Jews were given the right to defend themselves. In chapter 9, and we'll do this quickly, the Jewish people fight against their enemies. But there are some of the people that had been enemies that got on the side of the Jewish people. They ran over to the Jewish side. But among those that were killed were the sons of Haman. What happened to them eventually? In reading the text, and you go back and read it for yourself and see if you come, it seems as though they were killed in battle, and after they're dead, they were hanged. I believe that's exactly what happened. And they were killed along with 75,000 others, and there was a second day of fighting that was proclaimed. But on the 4th day of Adar, there was rest in the villages, but in Shushan, the rest was not until the 15th day. The 14th and the 15th day began when the rest in the villages was proclaimed. And there is a feast that the Jews still honor called the Feast of Purim, Purim, lasts 2 days to celebrate the deliverance of the Jews in the Persian Empire, their deliverance from their enemies. And then in chapter 10, there are 3 verses that tell us that Mordecai was given to be the prime minister over all the land of the kingdom himself. So God's providence is written all through this book. There are some great lessons to be learned, and we have 1 minute to tell you those lessons. Lesson number 1, God can use evil men to accomplish good things for his people. He did it then, he can still. He used Cyrus, who was a Persian, to cause the people to come back out of their homeland, out of captivity. Number 2, Courage, which Esther had courage, is a virtue worth rewarding. 3, pride goes before destruction. That was Haman's downfall. Pride goes before a destruction, and the haughty spirit before a fall. 4, anger. And old Haman got angry, didn't he? I can just see his veins popping out on his neck. You ever been that angry? I can see his blood red face. I can see his eyes bulging out. He's so angry. And anger does nothing but build our own gallows. Whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also do what? Reap. And number 5, God takes care of his people. God's providence. Esther was at the right place at the right time. Mordecai was at the right place at the right time. And it was God's hand. Even though the name of God is not mentioned in this book, but God's hand was out there in the background, not miraculously, but providentially manipulating the events in the life of Esther. And had I time, I'd read you this quote from a man by the name of J. Sidlow Baxter, but permit me to read the last part of it. And this is not miraculous, he states, but it's meant to see the providential overruling as distinct from supernatural intervening. And I believe that's correct. All right, the book of Esther in 45 minutes. That's almost a record for anybody, especially me. And I hope you profited from it. I taught the book of Esther one time, and I've got 10 or 11 pages because I outlined every chapter. Every chapter's outlined along with some other material that was used in that study. It'd make a good study for a ladies' Bible class. Jason is going to be preaching over at Olive Manor this morning.